equity, who has the ability to have bodily autonomy, who gets civility, right? In other words, who's able to be 100% of themselves. So let me switch my screen share to a different screen. We're going to talk about this. So if I did this right, you should be able to see my screen. I'm using Google Jamboard for those of you who are familiar with it. And so what I'm going to ask you all to do is unmute yourselves and participate. And on the bottom, I have a bunch of different dimensions of diversity: race, age, ability, status, gender, sexual orientation, class, religion, language. And of course, at the top, we have our rights, our resources, our representation, and respect. And so maybe we'll start with the right and move our way to the left. So can you think of a group of people who came together and shared an identity related to language? We'll start with language, who had to struggle for rights. They had to struggle to gain equal rights, resources, representation, respect. So in terms of language, can we think of a group of people who share, in our case, a common language, who have had to struggle, and we'll say in the US or maybe at Caldwell, whichever one you want to think about, they've had to struggle to gain equal access to rights, resources, representation, and respect.
Maybe the African American community.
Okay, all right. So you know what? So African American. You know, I'm just going to put that into race. And there could be some overlap with language, but we'll put it over there. And now you all see why I don't write on the board, but we'll keep going.
Women.
Women, okay. So if we're talking about gender, women, all right.
Spanish.
One more time.
Talking as Spanish.
Okay, so Spanish speaking. Okay. Of course, I picked a hard one to start with language.
Gay, lesbian people.
Okay, so when we're talking about sexual orientation, we have, I believe it's I'm not fully up to this, LGBTQIA2S+, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, two-spirit, and then the additional not within any particular category. All right.
I'd say the Native Americans or indigenous population here. Okay. On this land.
So let's see, we could put that under race or language. I'm just going to put it under indigenous. Mm-hmm. I'm going to put it under language. All right.
Anyone who is not Christian.
Okay. All right. Can name some? I got space on my sheet. So let's see. Name some for me.
Anyone who practices Islam, Judaism, Hinduism. We can go on and on.
Okay. You know, let's look. We have religions listed. What other religions? Because we're at Caldwell, right? We care about spirituality. What other religions have had to work, come together to struggle for their equal access to rights, resources, representation, respect?
I would go as far to say atheism.
Okay, so atheists. In fact, in a recent poll, they asked individuals if a well-qualified candidate met all the criteria for president of the United States, except they were blank, would you still vote for them? And the highest category, which said no, was atheist or agnostic. Otherwise qualified, except for that, would not vote for them. So certainly that's a group that struggles. How about other religions? Other religions that have had to struggle for their equal access to rights, resources, representation, respect.
Wiccan.
Okay. All right, so we've got quite a few religions here that have had to kind of work to gain equal access to rights, resources, representation, and respect. And so, you know what? Let's talk about religion a little bit further. What group, in terms of religion, has, at least in the US, we'll talk US only, that's where we are, has had rights, resources, representation, and respect? They're not a group that has had to come together to fight for their equal share.
Catholic.
Okay, Catholic, and can we think, let's categorize that, because Catholicism was one branch of a bigger group.
WASPs. Christianity.
Okay. Christianity, right? So Right? So in the US, that group, generally speaking, has not had to struggle for rights, resources, representation, and respect. I mean, if you are a Christian, you get off for your holidays. It's just sort of built into our calendar, right? Okay, all right, let's see. Well, let's pick one. So with language, we said Spanish speaking, indigenous, maybe we'll look for what's above the line. What language speakers in the US have not had to work for equal access to rights, resources, representation, or respect?
English speakers.
Right, so if you're English speaking, all right, let's see. We've filled in the first two on the right side. How about with class? What classes have had to come together to struggle for equal access to rights, resources, representation, and respect?
Lower class.
Lower class.
Say it one more time.
Lower class.
Lower class, okay. And for me, maybe I'll define what I mean by class. For me, I have 4 factors in class. Class includes 1, the income you make. So how much your paycheck is. 2, your assets, because maybe you don't make a whole lot, but you happen to own a lot. 3, your education level. And then 4, your bloodline also influences your class. And when you think about those 4, income, assets, education level, and then bloodline, that last one is really hard to get by working hard. The first 3, there's a little control over, but the last one really, really tough. And a lot of us, when we think about class, we think about 3 categories. We think about lower class, middle class, upper class. I like to think of class as having 6 categories. We've got impoverished, working class, lower middle class, professional middle class, upper middle class, and then our owning class. And so if we had to think about those, which ones do you think would have to struggle? We've already said lower class, right, has had to struggle for equal access to rights, resources, representation, and respect. Which of those other categories do you think have had to struggle?
I think you could say from impoverished to professional.
Okay, so impoverished, and I'll just write them down, right? Working, lower middle. Let's see, professional middle. Which now leaves us with upper middle and owning class. Upper middle are the folks, middle class, but you're doing okay. You're doing decently well. Owning class, those are the people who own everything, right? Those are folks who don't really have to worry about money. Let me ask, if we had to put someone above the line, one of those categories that hasn't had to work terribly hard, they've always had rights, resources, representation, and respect, either their equal share or more, which one do you think would be on top?
Upper class.
Upper class?
Bloodline.
Owning.
So bloodline, but bloodline's part of class. And so between upper class and owning class, who do you think's on top?
Owning.
Probably our owning class, right? And our upper class might be up here. I mean, I would say maybe our upper class is maybe on the line, but the owning class, I mean, they probably have more than their fair share of rights, resources, representation, and respect. On sexual orientation, we said our LGBTQIA2S+ category. Which sexual orientation is then above the line, has had either a fair share or more than their fair share of rights, resources, representation, and respect?
Heterosexual.
Yeah, so individuals who are straight are heterosexual. All right.
Right. Right.
What about gender? So what about gender?
Male.
Okay. So is that male for under the line or above the line?
Above.
All right, so we got men above the line, right? And I acknowledge there's more than 2 genders, but I would argue that of all the genders, most of them would probably be under the line, right? Because let's say, for instance, you're transgender. Is that above or below the line?
Below.
Below, right? Transgender is below. So, and I would argue that whatever gender you can think of, it's probably below the line in all likelihood. All right. How about ability status? Yeah. Which groups in terms of ability status have had to struggle for rights, resources, representation, and respect?
Disabled people.
Okay, so I'll say disabled or differently abled. All right. And how about who's on top then? Which group in terms of ability status has not had to struggle for rights, resources, representation, and respect?
Able.
Okay. Able-bodied. All right, we got two more. Age, this is a tough one. Which age categories have had to struggle to have their equal access to rights, resources, representation, and respect?
The senior citizen, like above 60 or 65.
So seniors, right? Like our old people, our 65 plus people. All right. What other age groups have had to struggle for equal access to rights, resources, representation, and respect?
Could we say 18, considering that like it took a while for an amendment to allow 18-year-olds to get the right to vote?
So can we say, can I classify that under children? Is that all right?
Yeah.
All right, so children, all right. And let me ask, who have we always seen in terms of rights, resources, representation, and respect when it comes to age? And a good way to think about this is to think about when you are, when you're watching TV, what age group do you tend to see most often represented on TV?
Like 20s, middle age.
I tend to see 30s.
Yeah, like, so, I mean, most of the times we're saying like, 25 to like 45. I mean, that's sort of like the age bracket that we tend to see represented. When we think about our elected representative, most representatives, many of them fall within that category, maybe skewing a little bit older, but generally within that category. All right, so now I've left a little room for the big one. How about with race? Which racial groups have had to struggle, come together to struggle for equal access to rights, resources, representation, and respect?
Anyone who's not white.
Okay, let's discuss some of them.
Latinos,
Okay,
Middle Eastern,
Asian.
Asian,
okay.
Native American.
Okay, so indigenous.
Polynesian, Islander group.
Okay,
People who are multiple races.
biracial, yep.
the multiracial. All right, should have left more room for this. All right, so who then is above the line in terms of race?
White.
Caucasian.
All right, so I'm just gonna pause and say that you all came up with this, right? I did not come up with this, you all came up with this. And so let me ask you, think of for a moment, and you don't have to respond to this, but think for a moment, where are you in terms of each of these categories? Do you fall above the line or do you fall below the line? In what ways? Now, I would guess a lot of us probably are a little bit of each. We fall a little bit above the line in some areas. We fall a little bit below the line in some areas. We're all a mix of identities. But let me ask, can anyone think of examples in history of individuals who are above the line in all categories? Can anyone think in history, any notable figures or maybe media, I mean, anyone who's notable, who is white, 25 to 45, able-bodied men, straight, owning class, Christian, and English speaking?
The founders of the country.
I think I heard founding fathers. Okay, so our founding fathers were white, middle-class men, owning, et cetera, they kind of fit all these categories. Anyone else that you can think of that might be notable who is above the line in all categories?
Rockefeller.
Rockefeller, okay. So Rockefeller are kind of really rich people, right? All right, so our rich people.
Most of our politicians.
Many of our politicians, most of our politicians fit almost every single one of these categories. Someone said Rockefeller, and Rockefeller is an example of one that I think Rockefeller is the richest company owner to date adjusted for inflation. Did you know that in the United States, 98% of CEOs meet every single one of these categories? 98% of CEOs. And so let me ask, is that just by coincidence? What do you think caused that?
The systems they're set up.
The system set it up, right? It's interesting, right? It's interesting that we need individuals that are above the line, that have not had to work, come together to struggle for their equal access to rights, resources, representation, and respect. And it just so happens that these are the people that are politicians, our presidents, on our dollar bills, our CEOs. The folks who are above the line tend to be the closest, have the closest proximity to power. And that's the thing, is if you have the closest proximity to power, you can make and change the rules. Remember what I said earlier. Power is the ability to define reality and make other people respond to that reality. And let me ask you, if you are an individual, right, if your group happens to be above the line on all categories, might you be incentivized to maybe want to keep it that way, to pass power on to other people that are like you?
Yeah.
Right? So you might have some incentive to make and change the rules in such a way that it benefits you. And one thing I left off of this list is this ethnicity. And ethnicity is always a little complicated. I only had an hour, so I didn't want to go too much into it. But there are folks that have anglicized their name so that they're more generically white. So if you are above the line on many of these categories, but let's say with one of them, you're below the line, might there be an incentive to try to make yourself more in alignment with the people on top? There might be. Right? Let me switch back to my slide. What we just defined is privilege. Privilege is what happens when you are above the line. And when we think about privilege, and if you're above the line, it's not just privilege. I'm going to push you to think about this in a different way. This is white supremacy. White supremacy is not just being white. White supremacy is being white, male, able-bodied, straight, owning class, etc., etc. But we're talking about race. I mean, that's, after all, this series. So what is unique about race in this little model we've put together? What do you think?
It's something that you cannot change.
Yeah. Race is something that you can't change, right? Can you change your age? Yes, we will all get older. Your ability status, can that change? It could, right? Could you change your socioeconomic, your class? Sure, right? A lot of these things you could make some changes to. Not all of them, certainly some. But race is one of those things you can't change. And on top of that, race is one of those things that we first see. Oftentimes it's one of those things when you meet someone, that's how you notice them. I'm always amused with my colleagues who are like, Dr. Ling, I don't see race. Race doesn't matter. And then I overhear them introducing themselves and introducing me and saying, oh, he's that Asian guy over there. It's one of the first things we see. It's one of the first things that we use to identify people. I can't tell you how many times I've been mistaken for Anthony Yang on this campus. And for those of you who know who Anthony Yang is, we look nothing alike. But I've been mistaken for him. And so with race, there's a separation. On top of that, with race, you can predict outcomes based on race. There are systemic reasons why race and poverty are connected. Oftentimes, people will conflate race and class. But if you take a white family and a black family that's impoverished, and you keep everything else the same about them, everything identical about them, there's still going to be a difference. There's still going to be a difference in terms of how the world sees them, in terms of things like job opportunities, social capital, social services. Race follows you around. Privilege is to be above the line, is to be above the line on many of these things. And we have to recognize some of these categories we can pass in. For instance, my religion is not something that you see when you first meet me. And if I want to, I can pretend to be Christian, whether I am or not. So with each of these categories, you can potentially pass to avoid discrimination. And indeed, people will try to pass. There's a phenomenon known as code switching. Code switching is when you cannot bring 100% of yourself to the room. And so you need to switch it up. I'll give you an example. I'm bilingual. And I speak 2 languages. And sometimes there are feelings I have that happen in one language, and then I have to like translate that to English and try to explain it to the people I'm with. That takes extra effort, takes extra work. Privilege is the unearned advantages that are given to some of us because we either are or assume to be part of some more powerful group. Privilege, because it gives advantages to some of us, by definition, it excludes others from accessing these advantages. And they don't all have to be big things, they could be small things. Some of you might have seen the flyer for this particular talk. That's not my name. That is not the spelling of my name. It is a privilege to be able to have your name spelled correctly. And it's not even thought of. And so that is something that some of us have and some of us don't have. Privilege is the uneven distribution of power in our society. And for us, privilege is when some aspect of your life, it is just seen as normal, the standard. It's not questioned. It's not suspicious in any way. And we have some of these things. Some of us have them. If you are part of the dominant group, you don't have to learn about anyone else's culture. You are okay existing with your own culture. Those of us who are racial ethnic minorities, we've had to learn. We've had to learn what is the correct way to dress? What is the correct way to behave? What is the correct way to speak? We have had to learn how to interact in the dominant culture. And so oftentimes we like to play the oppression Olympics, right? Oh, I have it worse because this. I have it worse because of that. I think the harder conversation we need to have, we need to all acknowledge, is what privileges do we have? Privileges reflect power structures, reflect our society. We saw it when we came up with the diagram. It's not surprising that some of us are on top. Think about Caldwell. Who in positions of leadership meet all the criteria above the line? White, male, Christian, able-bodied, 25 to 40 something. There's a lot of folks in leadership. There's a lot of faculty. There's a lot of staff that meet many of those criteria. And it's not that you have to be like upset about it. Right? We all just have privileges. It is whether you're going to do something about it. Are you aware of that system? We need to acknowledge the privileges we have. If we are born on third base and we do not acknowledge that we were born on third base, then we live life thinking that we hit a triple. And that the reason we're here is that we worked harder to get here. The fact of the matter is some of us were born on third base, and we need to acknowledge that. What is this a picture of?
A snow globe.
Snow globe, okay. And what happens when you take a snow globe and you shake it up?
The flakes will fly up and fall back down.
All right, you get snow going up, right? When you shake up a snow globe, you get walls of white. I'll say it again. When you shake up a snow globe, you get walls of white. And some of you might be listening to this and you're thinking, but. And there's a natural defensiveness. I'm trying to shake things up right now. I'm probably not making friends doing it. But we need to acknowledge that it's there, that our privileges are there. As James Baldwin said, we can disagree and still love each other, unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. Now, if you happen to be in the privileged status, if you happen to be above the line, it's not an insult, it's a fact. If you have it, you have it. You can't be guilty about that. But you have a responsibility to it. You have a responsibility to do something about it. And rather than focus on the areas where you have disadvantage, focus on where you have privilege. Because remember, privilege equates with power. And we already said that power is the ability to define reality and make other people respond to that reality. And so if we expect the folks in the marginalized statuses, in the disadvantaged statuses to fix things, we're like asking folks who don't have the power to fix things. It is your responsibility if you are in the dominant status, if you have dominant characteristics, dominant traits, that you can do something about it. Tanya Israel says, I'll say the important parts. We tend to focus on oppression instead of privilege, because it's easier to look at the lens of my oppression and to see other people's privilege rather than looking at our own. But it's only by exploring and understanding our privilege and how systems have benefited us and how unearned advantages have affected us as practitioners, researchers, teachers, professionals, and yes, even students. It's not easy to look at privilege. Privilege is something that hides in our consciousness. There's resistance to it. But what I would ask, and I agree with Tanya here, if you're willing to do this, step into this process with an open mind and an open heart. Sometimes we feel resistant. We feel resistant when we have fear, when we're uncomfortable. And privilege is something that makes us uncomfortable because we have to acknowledge that we've been given something, whether we want it or not, that by definition keeps other people down. And we feel threatened when we're asked to fight against it. Let me give you an analogy. Has anyone here ever been to an airport and been on a moving sidewalk? On a moving sidewalk? Why do we have moving sidewalks? What is the purpose of a moving sidewalk?
To get somewhere faster.
Helps us get somewhere faster, right? I mean, that's why we have moving sidewalks. And let's say you're on a moving sidewalk and you walk along the moving sidewalk. What happens? So you walk, you're getting onto the moving sidewalk, you're getting from point A to point B, and instead of standing still, you decide to walk. What happens?
Get there a lot faster.
You get there a heck of a lot faster, right? And as a person who has had very tight connections in airports, I can tell you it works. What happens if you get on a moving sidewalk and you just stand there though?
You get on the other side anyway, but just in the place of the sidewalk.
Yeah, I mean, you're still gonna get there. You're still moving. Maybe not as fast, but you are still moving. The moving sidewalk is kind of like the privilege that underlies our society. It's the white supremacy that underlies our society. And you might say, well, I'm not doing anything to get there faster, right? I'm not a racist. I'm not a sexist, whatever. You might not be walking along the sidewalk, but you're still standing and you're still going to get there. The moving sidewalk moves regardless of whether you want it to or not. The machine will keep doing what it's doing, regardless of whether you hit the levers of the machine. What happens if you're on a moving sidewalk and you don't like where you're going? What do? How do you prevent yourself from being carried along?
You get off.
You get off. And how do you get off? Because you don't want to get to the end, right? You don't want to get to the end of the moving sidewalk. You're like, oh crap, I'm on the moving sidewalk. I didn't want to get to point B. How do we get ourselves back to point A?
You could reverse it if you could
Yeah.
move the sidewalk.
You got to go the other way. And not just go the other way, like walk. You have to hustle. You have to be sprinting the other direction to fight the forces. And what's going to happen to all the people on the moving sidewalk when you turn around and start going the other way?
They're not
I
going to
got angry.
They're going to be angry at you. They are not going to be happy at you. In fact, they might tell you to turn around. They might tell you, why are you causing such a pain? Why are you making things difficult for everybody? But the fact of the matter is the white supremacy in our society is like the moving sidewalk. And if you want to fight it, you can't just stand still. You got to be willing to go the other way. And you're going to face resistance. But let's say we're on the moving sidewalk and all of us decide we're going to turn around and go the other way. What happens then? Are people going to be as angry?
No.
Mhm.
People are not going to be as angry if we turn around and we're all going the same direction, right? So there is strength in numbers. So what I would say to you is that when we're going through this, as we are talking about these topics, what are you doing? What are you doing to run the other direction? What are you doing to fight that underlying society, that oxygen that we are all breathing, the thing that we are totally unaware of that has a force on us every single day? And so let me maybe pause there. I think I've got about 10 minutes left. I left a little bit of time for anything, any thoughts anyone has or Q&A. I went through it rather quickly, but I wanted to leave a little bit of time at the end.
Do you have any good resources or good websites or anything that people can visit to maybe read more about this kind of thing for next week?
I do. In fact, there's about 20 other slides that I had just in case I went a little too fast. But I do. If you know what, I will work with Sophie and I'll work with the team to assemble some readings that folks might find helpful.
Awesome.
I have a question.
Yes.
So let me turn on my, okay. So I have an idea that race or acknowledging or recognizing race is taught, because when my kids were little, they used to point out their friends by describing what they were wearing. Not like, he's wearing the blue shirt, not he's the black boy over there. Or he has, or she has blonde hair, or she has black hair. She's not she's Latina.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true?
So I think in our society, we have this like fear of being like ist, right? Being racist or sexist or whatever ist. And so we overcompensate, right? We end up feeling like, oh, well, we can't talk about race. Right? And it actually makes it worse, right? If we don't acknowledge it, right? If to not acknowledge color means to not acknowledge the differences that we have, right? When you say, if someone says to me, hey, Dr. Ling, I just see you as human, I don't see you as Asian, I'm upset at that because I like being Asian. That's important to me. That would like be for me saying, Victoria, you know what? When I see you, I don't see you as female. I just see you as a person. Victoria, is being female, I'm assuming you're female. Is being female important to you? Is that an important part of who you are?
Yeah, it's very.
Right? So if we don't acknowledge it, it's like saying that doesn't matter. Now, I think what happens is we feel like this worry that we're going to be perceived as being like racist, and then we're not able to talk about it, right? All of a sudden we have to say it in a whisper, right? Oh, Dr. Lingy's Asian. What's up with that? Now, I think as soon as we start, as soon as we start enacting the societal kind of forces, that's when it becomes a problem. So to acknowledge Dr. Ling is Asian, that's appreciative. To assume that because Dr. Ling is Asian, he must be good at ping pong and he must be good at math, that is a problem. I'm not good at either. So as soon as we start stereotyping people, and we acknowledge that it's not just individuals, right? It is societally. If we could solve racism by just fixing individual acts of meanness, it would be easy. We could just make a list of thou shalt not, and we will just correct people who have messed up. But it is more than just that. It is a system that we live in. It is a system that benefits some of us. Does that answer your question?
Definitely. Thank you.
There are questions, comments, reactions, complaints.
I don't have a question, but I just want to add on to what you said to Victoria earlier, Dr. Ling, like this concept of color blindedness that a lot of people have versus like actually acknowledging that it is a part, it is part of an identity of an individual, right? Being Black or being Asian or being white or anything, it is a part of you and part of who you are. And like not acknowledging it is not like a part of a solution, but in my opinion, it would be more like ignoring that there is a problem rather than
To deny the existence of color is to deny the existence of differences. To deny the existence of differences is to deny that we are treated different based on our differences in society. And to deny that we are treated differently because of our characteristics denies our responsibility to do something about that injustice. So first thing we gotta do is acknowledge. It can't be solved by saying, oh, let's just love each other as God's children. It's more than that. It takes a lot more than that. One of my heroes, let me put it up here, is Janet Mock. Janet Mock says, they're the courageous ones, the brave ones, the ones who have the audacity to be seen in a society that tells them that their existence does not matter. What are we doing to help those who society has said do not matter? So of course, let me put my information up just in case anyone wants to chat more about this.
I just have a comment. I just want to say I really appreciated the analogy of the moving walkway. That was a really good visual for me, I think. So I don't have anything else to say about that. I'm just really going to be sitting with that image over the next week.
I agree too. And I think I'm going to bring it when I have conversations with people about privilege and things like that. It's a very good analogy to use in that. So thank you.
Sure.
Would you say then that, because to me it seems like now that we've acknowledged, right, what privilege is and what it means in terms of power, that if we really want to start moving towards bringing equity on campus, we need to start talking about who has power and how to share that power more equitably. And that's not necessarily solved just through conversations, I think.
Yeah. I mean, we came up with a diagram and we acknowledge that, you know what, there are certain categories where some of us have more rights, resources, representation, and respect. And if we want to do something about this, we can't just sit around and be nice to each other. We have to recognize, what are we doing about this? What can we do about this? Because if we just sit around and be nice to each other, now we have an oppressive society, an oppressive campus, an oppressive, classroom where we just all happen to be nice and oppressive. Doesn't take the oppression away.
I have a question. Do you have any resources for how to tackle this issue or this conversation in the workplace? Because I feel like in a space like this, everyone at least comes in with the idea that, okay, we are going to talk about it. This is what we're here for. But often if you're in situations outside, maybe in the workplace or maybe in a community setting, you might not be ready for that conversation. So how do you approach the topic?
So conversations about race are challenging. I mean, race violates in academia, race violates a few different principles that we have. It violates this like academic principle that we think of things without any emotion. Race talk by definition has emotion. Race violates the politeness principle, right? We're supposed to be, it's not considered a polite dinner conversation topic. Not to say that we shouldn't talk about it, but we have to acknowledge that. And there are lots of resources out there. There's a book that I like, So You Want to Talk About Race, which has a lot of good tips. For those of you who were here last year or maybe 2 years ago, we read it as part of a book club. So You Want to Talk About Race. It's a good book. Easy to understand, written for kind of a general basic level.
Yeah.
Abdul, Sophie, how much time do we have left?
We have 2 minutes left.
All right, 2 minutes for any comments, thoughts that folks have.
I was just going to add that the thought of uncomfort, like discomfort, when it comes to having conversations of race is, I guess, what stops us from having conversations often. So one thing that we could do is maybe work on breaking this preconceived notion of discomfort while talking about race that we might have.
It's something that we all have to work on, right? How do you have uncomfortable conversations? And it takes time. I mean, fortunately, I'm a psychologist. I get paid to ask uncomfortable questions, have uncomfortable conversations. That's years of training there, but every one of us can do it. You just gotta be willing to lean in, step outside your comfort zone a little bit. Martin Luther King said, at the end of our days, it's not the actions of our enemies, but the silence of our friends.
Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Ling. That was very, very insightful. And to everyone here, thank you for participating and sharing your thoughts and everything. And I strongly encourage you to come along next week. It'll be the same time, same Zoom link, I believe. And we're going to have more of an open discussion, more Q&As if you think about it. We'll try to get some resources out this week and the recording of the video to kind of like give you some things to think about, and then come back next week with any questions that you have for Dr. Ling, for us, anything you want to bring up. It's completely open. So thank you again, and feel free to sign off when you want to.